I'm Mike Minear. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Salmon Matter. There is a major landslide that has caused an obstruction in the upper Fraser River at the Big Bar location not far from Kamloops that's keeping many of our Pacific salmon stocks from being able to return to their natal streams and rivers to spawn. Here to tell us more about the ongoing effort to clear that obstruction is Gwil Roberts. He's the director of the Big Bar Landslide Response team with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and he's joining us today from his home office in Victoria. Gwil, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I know you've been working hard with lots of folks for many months. We're very excited to get into the details here. You've made a lot of progress. Gwil, why don't you start by telling those that are watching a little bit of background? First of all, where is Big Bar exactly? And when do you think this landslide occurred, and how do you think it occurred?
So the Big Bar landslide is approximately 60 kilometers due north of Lillooet. So as the crow flies, about 60 kilometers. It's about 100 kilometers along the West Pavilion Road there. And if you were heading up from the mouth of the Fraser to the Big Bar slide, that would be about 365 kilometers from the mouth of the Fraser. The slide itself was discovered at the end of June in 2018. We believe the slide happened in approximately October, November of 2018, but it wasn't discovered until the summer of 2019, mainly because it's a very remote region of the province. Not many people are living in that area, and the slide happened at relatively low water, so there wasn't an indication of any major change in river flows or volumes to provide us any clues.
Yeah, this is in a very remote location, isn't it, Gwil?
That's correct. So the nearest town, to the south is Lillooet. To the east is Clinton. You're at least an hour and a half by gravel road to the vicinity. You need to cross the Fraser if you're coming from the Clinton area. This is traditional ranch country. This is the Caribou, and it is an area that has very little infrastructure. Some roads, and that's really about it.
So who actually discovered the landslide, the obstruction?
So the discovery happened through a local landowner. So he was informed by actually a rafting operation that was surveying the river and looking to raft the river. And so that information was passed to the landowner. The landowner contacted Fisheries and Oceans. And we immediately sent crews out by helicopter to have a look to see what was going on. So there was representatives from the federal government, from the provincial government, and from First Nations that reviewed the slide area and immediately realized that this was a major impact to the river.
And also a major impact on salmon, as we have learned. Give us a sense from the Fisheries and Oceans Canada perspective, how serious of an issue is this for the many Pacific salmon stocks that have to go through that area? What's the big picture relative to salmon?
Well, the slide itself and its location on the Fraser, it has 100% blocked the passage of salmon. So at certain flow levels. Now, what we observed in 2019 was that any flows, and we measure flows here in cubic meters per second, any river flows that were above, say, the 3,000 or the 3,500 cubic meters per second flow rate, were stopping salmon from migrating over the slide site. Some salmon were able to get across on their own effort in August and into September and beyond, because water levels were dropping. But certainly any salmon arriving from May through to August were being stopped, and were many of those, or the vast majority of those salmon were dying. There was a high mortality rate. So that was the initial response, was to realize the magnitude of the problem, and then put measures in place to try and move those salmon through a couple of different means across the slide site. What does that mean overall? Well, this is an extreme threat to the salmon population. Any salmon that migrate north of this area, and there are many salmon-bearing streams. The salmon are moving up to Stewart Lake, to Chilco system. There are many tributaries and salmon-bearing streams, as I mentioned, that would be devoid of salmon if the slide is not remediated, if it's not cleared.
Yeah, and it was not a great news story last year in terms of the number of salmon that were actually able to return to their natal streams. But of course, it was not. Certainly wasn't because there weren't Herculean efforts. You all worked very hard last year. Tell us a little bit about what you did last year to move those fish, to help them to try to get home to spawn.
So the response last year, what was set up was what we call an incident command system or response, and the idea there was it was a joint operation between the province, the federal government, and First Nations. What happened was camp was set up. There were crews that were working from Lillooet, and we tried, following the assessment of the block, we immediately mobilized crews to the area. So within a week of discovering the block, we were on site developing a plan. And what precipitated from there was salmon that couldn't get across the slide on their own. They were gathered, they were netted, and they were put into tanks, and they were moved by helicopter, and some were moved by truck as well. So that was the measures those were the measures available to us last summer. Again, they were moving damaged fish that were injured, fish that had been at the slide site for maybe a couple of months and had been consistently trying to move over the slide and get to the other side. So they were tired, and as a result, even though we were able to transport a fair number of them across the slide site, there was still high mortality for those fish. So it was a very bad year last year.
Yeah, fish generally don't like being trucked and helicoptered. So if they'd been holding there for many weeks, and then you have to do this extra stress on top of it, it was an against all odds sort of effort. Okay, so give us a sense, Gwil. That was last year. Let's sort of fast forward. We want to learn more about what you've been doing since then. There's been a lot of progress made, I understand. But before we do that, when will the Pacific salmon that are going to be migrating naturally through this obstruction, when do they start returning to that area this year?
So we're expecting the first salmon to arrive actually very soon, towards, within the next week or so, within the next 2 weeks. So by the end of May, we will have a number of fish arriving at the slide site. Okay.
And you've been working, it's been over a year now, if I recall, that this started. Let's get into now a little bit of detail about the various solutions that you've had to come up with to try to fix this problem. Can you walk us through what you're doing and how that's working?
The first step here was to, following what the work that happened in 2019, was to get an industrial heavy equipment operator onto the site to try and remove as much rock from the area. So that was what we call a remediation effort. A contract was tendered and awarded to Peter Hewitt Sons, ULC, so a very large, competent, and highly resourced company. Mm. They immediately mobilized to the site. They had trucks and equipment up at Big Bar by mid-January, and they worked really hard, really diligently to get access to the slide site. So with that remoteness, with that isolation of the landslide area, there's no road access to the slide. And wow. installing a road was certainly one of the first priorities. So in order to do that, they were running. There was some tracks, and they were able to get within a couple of kilometers of the slide site. But then a road building exercise and a road building operation began. That meant overcoming some extreme obstacles as well, because there was a high point, what we now refer to as the Razorback. And in order to punch a road through to the slide site, they had to build the road over top of this Razorback. And that required a tremendous amount of drilling and blasting to reduce the elevation of that Razorback, so you could get a usable road grade installed. So about 32 meters of height was reduced at the Razorback through drilling and blasting. We basically put a pass through this fin, and then the road had to be built on the other side down to the slide area. And again, now you're dealing with another steep grade, and we're up against a canyon. You're basically up against a canyon wall as well. So
and this is all just to get started on actually working on the obstruction.
That's correct. Yes, and that wasn't. There were multiple concurrent activities happening there as well.
Okay.
So the road was being built. At the same time, they were lowering an excavator down one of the canyon walls to facilitate and expedite that road production, that road construction. They were also planning and drilling what we call the east toe. So the east toe is a rock outcropping that extends on the east side of the river, and it's a naturally formed constriction point. So this slide could not have, it happened at a very bad spot, because the canyon there was already constricted, and then the rock slide just made things that much worse. So one of the plans that were generated was to remove that outcropping, and that required basically on the east side of the riverbank, there is no road access, and it is a very steep grade.
Wow.
And the only way to move crews in there was by helicopter. So every day through the winter, in some very formidable weather, we're talking about the Caribou in winter. You're easily reaching negative 30 degrees Celsius, and crews were dropped off. They would then rappel down to the east toe, where they would have drilling equipment, and they would drill all day long and prepare charges. So that piece was also ongoing, and as you probably know, the east toe was blasted on two different occasions. That east toe was successfully removed.
This is the challenge, of course, Gwil, is the Mother Nature working against you. When the weather is nice and warm, that's when water flows are highest, correct? As opposed to in the winter, when the weather is cold and very unfavorable, that's when the water levels are the lowest. And so when you're talking about these toes, these are actual above water elements of the obstruction, and that doesn't even account for everything that fell into the water below, right?
That's correct. So this toe, when Kiewit was drilling it, the toe was exposed because it was low water. So this drilling was happening through January, February, and March. The final blast happened at Easter in April. So what happens with that blasting and with the removal of the toe? Now that water has risen, you're seeing the benefits of that, because there's a wider channel for the river flows through the constricted area. But you're right. I mean, at the same time, Kiewit was also, once they had established that road, they were down at the slide site removing rock. They had rock trucks. They had large, heavy excavators, and they were also blasting rocks and boulders that were in the way. So they were building what we simply call fingers. There were these huge boulders in the mid channel, and Kiewit built fingers out to these boulders and blew up each one one by one. I think one of the other major concerns in this area is the rockfall hazard. There is extreme rockfall hazard on the west side, and this was always an issue. It was an issue for the incident command teams in 2019, and it continues to be an issue. So scaling crews were involved. This means you're rappelling teams down the side of the cliff. You're removing rock. Gwil had a strong plan to install what's called a rock mesh canopy, so that would collect any rock that fell down to the west area, the west bank of the river. And they also installed a very large mesh, a carpet of chain link mesh at the top of the cliff there too. So that was to prevent any rock falls. But it's an ongoing problem, and yeah.
And so what's your sense of how the blasting actually worked? How effective was it in terms of opening up some fish passage?
We noticed an improvement to the flows immediately after the blasting of the east toe on April 11th. So that was a good indication that it was a very positive operation, that all of that effort will pay off. It will reduce flows through the area. Unfortunately, our data was also showing us all along that this slide was going to continue to cause problems for us into 2020. The sheer volume of material that landed in the river, we're talking, up to 80,000 cubic meters of rock landed in the river, and there's just not enough time to get in there and remove it. Even if we'd had many more months of low water, it's still this is a huge impediment to us.
Well, we'll stop it there. That'll be our first segment of our conversation with Gwil Roberts. He's the director of the Big Bar Response Team for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Salmon Matter. We'll have a second part in this conversation with Gwil Roberts coming out shortly. Until then, thanks for joining Salmon Matter, and stay well.